Stoicism, it's for people who can't control the external world and they say, well, the internal virtue, that's where it matters.
Stoicism is largely, or at least maybe originally, for coping. The Stoicism that is very popular today is a kind of watered down Stoicism, which uses a lot of these coping strategies.
It tells us something about society when philosophies like Stoicism spreads. Cato's Stoicism is for show. It's to build up a political image, a political brand.
Yeah, the Stoics famously say the wise man is going to be happy even while being tortured.
Right.
But then it raises sort of commonsensical objections. Really, wouldn't you be happier if you also were not being tortured?
Stoicism was one of my first introductions to philosophy, and I had picked it up during quite a difficult time in my life. I dropped out of school, my startup was failing, and on top of all that, I was going through all the teenage growing pains. I was initially attracted to the Stoic idea that happiness is in my control because it made me feel a bit better about my chaotic life. But as I've matured, I've become increasingly suspicious of Stoicism for that precise reason. Stoicism seems less like a philosophy that captured some fundamental truth, but more of a coping mechanism that at best told comforting lies. I started seeing Stoic ideals, like being able to bear the death of your child unperturbed, as neither desirable nor plausible. My guest today is a leading classicist, Katharina Volk, and we're here to stress test Stoicism. Our goal is to see how well these ideas actually hold up under tension, specifically in the tumultuous late Roman Republic. This was a period of conflict, bloodshed, and rapid change, and we're going to examine the fascinating lives of people like Cato to see how well Stoicism performed in reality. What we find in this period is that Stoicism does often appear as a coping mechanism. You see a spike in popularity among the side who lost the Roman Civil War, and you see another explosion of Stoicism as the Republic gives way to empire, when citizens of a free state suddenly find their freedoms curtailed. But is it bad that Stoicism often manifests as cope? And what does that say about our own age, where Stoicism is again on the rise? My name is Jonathan B. I'm studying the great books and sharing their insights through lectures and interviews. If you want to join my journey and learn with me, please subscribe. Without further ado, Professor Katharina Volk. In this interview, I want to examine not just the ideas of Stoicism, but how Stoicism and Stoics held up under the tumultuous period of the late Roman Republic. But let's begin on the ideas level first. Can you share with us the basic tenets of Stoicism?
Yes. So Stoicism is a Hellenistic philosophy. So it was founded in the late 4th century in Athens. And like most or maybe all philosophies of this time, the goal was happiness or eudaimonia. And there was this idea that there was one thing or just a very few things that if you had that, you had the key to this happiness. And in Latin, this is called the summum bonum, or the greatest good. And for the Stoics, this is virtue. Now, virtue sounds a little bit sort of ye olde in English.
Yeah, right.
But it's still a good word to use. So it means the morally right. So if you have virtue, you know what is right, and you know how to act in a right way. And so for the Stoics, that's what you need. And if you have that, you have everything it takes. You have the summum bonum, and you're automatically going to be happy. Now, this is, of course, you have to have knowledge. You have to know what this is, right? And you have to act accordingly. So you could say that's not so easy, but if you do it, then you have happiness, and then you have basically fulfilled your task as a human being. And now the sort of interesting corollary of this is that this is completely independent from whether your virtuous action is successful or not. One image that the Stoics like to use is that of the archer who is shooting an arrow to hit a target. So what the archer needs to do is to shoot this arrow as well as he possibly can. That's the art of archery. It is not actually hitting the target, because in hitting the target, there could be all sorts of, chance occurrences that could prevent you from hitting the target. Like what if the target falls down,
right. There's wind,
or there's wind, or something like that. So the archer is not, on this scenario, is not going to be upset if he didn't hit the target through no fault of his own, because he did his best to do it. So his virtue consists in, doing the best to hit the target. It does not consist in succeeding. So this, in a nutshell, is Stoic ethics.
Can you tell us a bit more about the shape of virtue or the right thing? What is the form of virtue? Is it specific to us as humans, or because we're rational agents? Or elaborate on that.
So it is specific to us as humans, which, as you say, does entail being rational agents. In theory, we have a knowledge of this that's innate to us. In practice, unfortunately, because of society and education not being what it should be, lots of people get completely wrong ideas of right and wrong and have to be sort of educated, to understand what it is. But in principle, it is part of human nature.
When we think Roman philosophy, we think Stoicism, right?
Yeah.
Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, but that's in the empire.
Yes.
Is Stoicism popular in this late Roman Republic era that we're going to examine today?
Yeah. No, it's interesting because, as you say, it does get very much associated with Rome, and there are a lot of Stoics in the empire. At the time, it's certainly a philosophy that is well known to people who have studied philosophy, but we don't actually know of that many adherents to it. I mean, named adherents. The younger Cato is actually the only one.
Wow, really?
Where we can be totally sure.
I see. And I want to start highlighting that interesting fact that as soon as people start losing their freedoms, as soon as people maybe could dictate their lives less, this philosophy about it's not important what the outcome of your actions is, it's important about the internality of your decisions became wildly popular. We're going to come back to this motif of Stoicism as cope over and over again in this interview. But I want to start highlighting that very fact, that in the Roman Republic period, it actually wasn't, that we know of, incredibly popular. Here's my last general question I want to ask about Stoicism. Does Stoicism naturally tend to retreat, withdrawal, or to political engagement?
Political engagement is part and parcel of Stoicism because the Stoics do believe that human beings are social, that they are political, and that indeed it is sort of the highest calling of human beings to work for society and get politically involved. But then they also have an idea that they are cosmopolitanists, the Stoics. So they think that the whole cosmos is a polis, so that is a city, is a political entity, and that human beings and the gods, we're all citizens of that. And they certainly have what people also today call cosmopolitan ideas, which is that you're not just beholden to the people in your own community, but also to people outside it, and in fact, like people in the entire universe.
Right. What I'm hearing on your answer to the why political engagement question is that it's a virtue to engage in the polis. In the case, the polis is the entire universe. And so virtue is relative to us as humans, but I think I missed something when I said that humans as rational creatures, there's probably another part of it, which is that humans are also social creatures, right? So it's in our nature to be both social and rational. And so both of those two different natures have competing demands of virtue. And out of the social one is where we get this urge for political engagement. Is that right?
Right.
So now we have a rough understanding of not just Stoicism, but Stoicism in Rome. The obvious question is, can these ideas actually be embodied? And I think if anyone has a claim to having embodied and actually lived the life of a Stoic, it's Marcus Cato, right? So tell us who Cato was.
Right. So this is the so-called younger Cato to distinguish himself from his ancestor, the older Cato in the 2nd century BCE. So the younger Cato was a member of the Roman upper classes. He was a senator, and leading up to the Civil War, especially in the 50s, 50s, and then in the Civil War itself, made himself the opponent of Caesar and people like Caesar, and the sort of upholder of the traditional senatorial rule. So anytime something that was not totally constitutional, it would always be Cato who would be opposing this in the Senate. So he became the leader of a, might say, hyper-conservative, very uncompromising faction at Rome. And then when the Civil War broke out in 49 between Caesar and Pompey, he joined Pompey. And unlike a lot of other people, for example, Cicero, when Pompey was first defeated, a lot of people said, okay, this is it. I'm going to throw myself on Caesar's mercy. I'm going home to Rome. The war is over for me. Cato went on fighting against Caesar and fought in northern Africa. And when it became clear that he was defeated, he actually committed suicide rather than falling into the hands of Caesar, let alone being pardoned by Caesar, which he really did not want. And by doing this, by committing suicide in a very philosophical fashion, he kind of made himself this, great martyr for the Republic.
Right. This is how Cicero famously described Cato. Cato behaves as if he were in the Republic of Plato rather than among the dregs of Romulus.
Yes.
What Cicero was trying to get at here was that Cato was notoriously stubborn. Mm-hmm. Can you share some stories of just how stubborn and eccentric a character Cato was?
Right. Yeah. So Cicero, who was often politically on the same page with Cato and agreed with him, but was just sort of driven crazy by this stubbornness and sort of really histrionic behavior of Cato, because Cicero was into making compromises and Cato very much was not. Cato, for example, was famous for his filibusters, which was a thing in Rome as well. So he would just keep on talking and wouldn't shut up. At some point, he was actually dragged off by his political opponents and put in prison. He actually brought a motion against Caesar for genocide in Gaul, where everybody else is voting some Thanksgiving for Caesar's great victories against the Germans and the Gauls. Cato said, no, we're not going to thank the gods. We have to ask the gods forgiveness for these horrible things that he keeps perpetrating over there. He sort of dressed in this strange way. He went around without shoes. He was just wearing a tunic without the toga, probably to show some sort of philosophical austerity a la Socrates. After the Catilinarian conspiracy during Cicero's consulship, so Murena had been elected consul for the next year, and there was a case against him for electoral bribery. Now, this case was probably totally justified because electoral bribery was just something extremely common. But Cicero felt that this was absolutely politically not the thing to do, because this was a staunch conservative who would be just the ticket, you would have thought, for someone like Cato. But Cato just stood on principle and prosecuted Murena. Now he got his comeuppance, because then Cicero, who defended Murena in his speech, made fun of Cato's Stoicism in a very, very funny speech.
But I think the key thing to take away here is, much like the Stoic teachings prescribe, Cato probably knew this was not a politically advantageous move, but he just did it because it was the principled move, right?
It was the principle,
right.
Yes.
Here's a probably less principled, but no less eccentric story about Cato, which is that he divorced his wife so that Hortensius, another one of these aristocratic senators, could marry her, and then remarried her when Hortensius passed away. Tell us about that.
Yes, I mean, this is really strange. I mean, it is a fact that divorce was very commonplace in the Roman elite, and also that people married for dynastic reasons, but even at the time it raised eyebrows. I mean, it seems to sort of the idea was that Hortensius didn't have any children and was already somewhat older, and by marrying Cato's wife, and I think indeed she did bear him a child, and so this all worked out. But he sort of like lent Hortensius his wife, and then when Hortensius died, he married her again, and so even for the Romans, this was a little bit strange.
Odd.
But yeah, you could sort of argue, yeah, it's a totally rational thing to do. I mean, never mind what did the wife think, right? I mean, let's leave that out of there. But
right. Let me quote to you your book. Cato's Stoicism explains much of his more unusual behavior. Stoicism famously holds that virtue is the only good and as such sufficient for happiness. All apparent goods and evils are instead indifferents of no consequence for a person's living a good and blessed life. Nevertheless, some of these indifferents are preferred, health, wealth, while others are dispreferred, illness, poverty. The wise man's virtue consists in knowing which preferred indifference he ought to pursue and how, and in dedicating himself to this pursuit.
right.
The thing I want to emphasize here is something we emphasized in our other interview about Cicero and Caesar, which is that there's a surprising coherence between these Roman senators' philosophical ideas, their personalities, and also their political actions.
Yeah.
Cicero was a student of the skeptical school, which famously argued all different sides of an argument. And that's how Cicero was like as a politician, as you described.
Right.
He's famous or infamous for his compromise. But Cato, the Stoic,
Right.
and Stoicism is about doing the right thing,
Right.
regardless of the outcome. That's how his politics manifested. So do you think we should read Cato's politics as the outcome in some strong way of his Stoicism?
Yeah, I mean, I think in this case, you really might, right? I mean, that it really maps on so well over this, that indeed this sort of uncompromising and very impractical attitude, this sort of take no prisoners, right? Because the outcome doesn't matter.
Right, we don't negotiate with terrorists.
Yeah, no, I think that's right.
Right. Does Stoicism furnish the content of Cato's politics? So we discussed how it furnishes the form, right? This unrelenting adherence to principle. What about his hyper-conservatism? Is that furnished by Stoicism?
I don't necessarily think so. Stoicism doesn't spell out. It certainly would prescribe certain types of actions, like, for example, anything that is incredibly emotional, anything that is really, detrimental to communities or even the cosmopolitan community as a whole. But you want to do the thing that is right for the community, but you have to figure out yourself what that means.
What about this specific form of Cato's politics? So in Cato's case, Stoicism furnished him with this unrelenting, probably not too productive, sort of overly principled form of politics. Is that how Stoicism always manifests in political life? When you think about later Stoic politicians, or in Marcus Aurelius' case, emperor, does Stoicism always lead to this type of unrelenting adherence to principle?
I guess it depends, on what the situation is. Right? So, obviously, if you're in the opposition, which is what Cato was all his life, more or less, then, you can, of course, always have wonderful performances, and you can be unyielding, and you can filibuster, and you can do this and that. If you are the person who is actually running the show, like Marcus Aurelius, if you're the emperor, right, then that's
it becomes even less untenable, right?
It becomes very, very difficult. Then you get a very different, I have to do my duty here. There are going to be all these unpleasantnesses and all these people who don't have the wisdom that I have, but I just have to put up with this, and I have to do my job, which is also, and Marcus says that it's the job of the universe. You have to get up in the morning and do the job of the cosmos. So I think it's a different personality, it's a different situation, and maybe it's also a slight development over time of Stoicism itself, that the Stoicism of Marcus is much more sort of accepting in a way, that I have to really insert myself into the thing that is happening anyway. Now, this is Stoic, and ultimately Cato had to follow along fate as well. But he saw it as his role, to put up resistance as long as he could. There's also this Stoic so-called persona theory. What virtue is and what the right thing to do is not absolute. It's not deontological like Kant or so. So it's really specific to circumstances and also to the person. And so you have to factor in your own character. So, you could argue, right, that Cato just had this incredibly unyielding, headstrong, stubborn character.
Right.
So his stoicism, then maybe you could argue, right, manifested in a certain way, whereas for another Stoic, maybe Marcus Aurelius, who was maybe a more compromising, productive, but also I feel always somewhat melancholy character, that for him this sort of manifested in a different way.
Right. I think this is a fascinating case study of how philosophy actually becomes embodied. In the case of Aurelius and Cato, what's consistent is the general Stoic principle that adhering to the principle, adhering to virtue itself, that's what's important, not the outcome. But adhering to what principle is very different. In Cato's case, it was at the abstraction level of political principle.
Right.
But Marcus Aurelius was more willing to bend on those political principles, but he had his own principles of his own character that were much more individualistic. That's what we're getting at. And I think the interesting explanation for that is a development of Stoic ideas themselves, that the ideas themselves have become more accommodating, but also difference in personality, as well as just different in practical political circumstance. You can't rule an empire as Cato did, right? And I don't know if this is a fringe theory, but I've heard that many people actually blame Cato for the destruction of the Republic itself, because Pompey and Caesar, I mean, they're almost like they were part together of the same triumvirate, and they don't have any ideological disagreement. And it was Cato and Cato's hardline hyper-conservatives that really pushed Pompey against the increasingly powerful Caesar. Do you think that this specific brand of Stoicism actually brought down the Republic in some sense?
I certainly wouldn't want to blame Stoicism for the demise of the Roman Republic, but certainly Cato's behavior, as Cicero and others kept saying, did not help. Would it have been possible? I mean, there were so many moments where, there could have been some kind of negotiation. But even then, I mean, I think Caesar would still have wanted to, further his power, and everything could have just gone into another round. So,
but I do agree with you that even if Cato is to blame, Stoicism doesn't have to be to blame because Cato is to blame. It could be Cato, right?
That's right.
And I think the third Stoic that we should have looped in is Epictetus, right? Who's in a completely different circumstance in that he's a slave. So not only he's not an emperor, he's not a senator, he's a slave. And his Stoicism manifests obviously in a completely different way.
That's right. I mean, the people you might look at more to compare to Cato are the so-called Stoic opposition under emperors like Nero and Domitian, and there you sometimes get a sort of, principled stand or stubbornness against power that was literally inspired by Cato. That legacy lives on. But you're right that by the time you get to Marcus and to Epictetus, it also becomes much more sort of internalized, I think, philosophy.
I see. I want to go back to the quote about indifference, preferred indifference, and indifference that are not to be preferred. And I just want to double click on, is that not an oxymoron? If something is indifferent, in what way can it be preferred? If virtue is the only good, then surely, because they do say it's the only good, right? It is as strong as that.
That's right.
Then for what other reasons other than goodness do I have to pursue and stay away from other things?
Yeah, well, Cicero has problems with this too. But I mean, it is in fact a sort of clever way of dealing with this. So if you have only one good, Right.
Virtue in this case.
And these philosophies, they always are predicated on it must be possible, right? It must be up to us. We must be able to achieve the good, because if not, then we can't be happy, and that would be bad. And these are optimistic philosophies. So therefore, it's better to just have one good. Don't have a lot of goods, because
especially a good in your control.
Yeah.
Right?
So you have to have one good, and it has to be totally in your control. And so on this reading, virtue is totally in your control. So that means all sorts of other things that normal people or philosophers like Aristotle might call goods, like health, wealth, success, beauty, all sorts of things that normal people might consider goods or evils, like illness. Those things are neither good nor bad, so they are indifferent. But then they are not all the same.
Right.
So they're not all indifferent in the same way. So some are preferred indifference and some are dispreferred indifference. So you would still rather be healthy. So it's a preferred indifferent. But if you don't have it, no problem. It doesn't do anything for my happiness because it's not a good, right? That's the thing. So what the Stoic then does is that the Stoic has to decide every single minute what preferred indifference to pursue and what dispreferred indifference to, try to shun. And it may depend on the situation, what it is at any given moment. But the fact that these are just indifference and are not actually goods, that makes it possible that you are in control, because you're not in control of health and wealth and all that.
And that, again, is something I find very suspicious of Stoicism. It seems like Stoicism is trying to get to a point and trying to build a metaphysics around this point that you are ultimately in control of your eudaimonia.
Right.
And we're going to talk about whether Stoicism is a form of coping strategy, especially for the defeated a bit later on. But I just want to try this one more time. On what nature are the preferred indifference preferred if they're not good?
Human nature. I mean, that these are just things we naturally want or desire or not. And that's the way it is. But you see, the thing is, if there's a Stoic and you just, let's say there is a perfect Stoic and you observe that person acting, you wouldn't know that person was a Stoic, because, the person would be just doing a lot of things that other people are also doing. But he would be doing this with a totally different mindset.
So if virtue is the only thing required for happiness, and then there are preferred indifference, there must be another kind of happiness which the preferred indifference contributes to, right? Because surely they must change human nature in some way for them to be preferred.
Not according to Stoicism. So for Stoicism, it absolutely makes no difference. Now, there is another philosophy that Cicero discusses elsewhere called the Old Academy. And they indeed say exactly what you're saying. So you say you can be happy just with virtue. So virtue is sufficient for happiness, but you can be even happier if you have some of these external goods, which they actually call goods. But the Stoics say, no way, you're actually just as happy. And, the Stoics famously say, the wise man is going to be happy even while being tortured.
So this Old Academy view sounds somewhat like Kant, right? Who pulls apart goodness and happiness. That sort of the good life is what's important, what's primary, but a good life does not always lead to happiness, right?
Something I wouldn't want to pronounce on Kant, but it's more like Aristotle, really, where Aristotle is really more sort of hedging. So this whole we have to have one good and that's it. So this is a slightly later development, which is nice, because if you have the one good, then you got it. But then it raises sort of commonsensical objections of this kind. So really, wouldn't you be happier if you also were not being tortured?
Right. Do you find this Stoic view plausible?
Well, I think it also depends on what you mean by happiness, right? Which is not necessarily the feeling of happiness, but it's just meaning that you have this sort of flourishing, holistic, good life. But yeah, no, I think it's a tall order.
I see. Do you think Cato lived up to the Stoic ideal?
Well, I think in many ways, yes. Now, the Stoics themselves basically say that despite the whole idea that it's all, supposed to be possible and attainable, that there has never been a wise person, or maybe only one, namely Socrates. So in other words, they weren't necessarily optimistic about anybody living up to this anyway. And so Cato was famously irascible. So he got angry, he lashed out at people. That is very unstoic. Even he was not always completely consistent in his politics. So he would do the typical Roman playing of favorites. When his own family members were involved in bribery, he did not prosecute them. And he did, on very rare occasion, also, make some political compromises. Cato was certainly not a Stoic saint, though later in the imperial period, he is sort of sometimes portrayed as,
right? I see. So that critique is not too damning for Cato's Stoicism, because we're saying that, no, he asymptotes, right? He's as good as someone can reasonably get in his shoes.
Yeah.
The next critique of Cato's Stoicism, I think, could be devastating, which is that Cato's Stoicism is for show. It's to build up a political image, a political brand.
Yeah.
And let me quote to you your book. Cato was a spirited public performer and relished displaying the odd but admirable behavior that had come to be expected from him. In other words, Cato was highly accomplished at playing Cato. So in this reading, Cato's adherence to his Stoicism is actually for notoriety, because it's actually advantageous to play this Stoic archetype. Do you think this is a fair critique?
Right. Yeah. I mean, it is definitely the case that Cato was this kind of performer, and again, it was like it was driving other people crazy.
But for notoriety, that's the key part of the critique. He did it for notoriety, not for adherence.
Did he do it for notoriety, or was it part of, the kind of public performance that obtains in ancient Rome anyway, right? Where in a way you're always a performer, you're an orator, you build up a kind of persona for yourself. Is it sort of part and parcel of that, or is this really becoming vanity? It's hard to know, right? I mean, was Cato just...
Did he really not like shoes, or did he, did he not wear shoes because...
was he just a sort of stoic?
Showman, right.
Just like people were accusing Cicero of being this shameless self-promoter. And who knows?
What does Stoicism have to say about the desire for glory, recognition? Is it preferred indifferent, or is it actually something quite helpful?
I would say that in most cases it is a preferred indifferent. Like good reputation. I mean, because these societies are so based on this idea of reputation and fame, that it would be a preferred indifferent. But then, of course, there would be all sorts of corollaries about what true glory is. And of course, you want to be recognized. You want to have a reputation for the right thing.
Right, I see. So obviously, the mere fact that Cato desired reputation is not an argument against his Stoicism.
No.
But if he did all of his actions to gain that reputation, that would be suspect, because you're supposed to do it not for a consequence, which gaining a reputation would be.
I mean, one of the problems with Cato, unlike, say, with Cicero, is that Cato didn't write anything. So we don't have any statements from Cato. So we all have to sort of infer this from what we know about Cato, so from how people tell us he behaved, and then from what other people say about Cato, like Cicero, for example. So Cicero talks a lot about what he's doing, why he's doing it. I mean, and you could say he's talking a little bit too much about this, but we have so much of what Cicero wrote, including the letters and everything, but we don't know about Cato. So what was Cato thinking? Right? We ultimately don't know. I mean, was he just a vain showman, or was he just so sincere about this?
Yeah. I mean, even his death was very literary.
Yes.
He read Plato's Phaedo.
Yeah, it was clearly he was modeling himself on Socrates. Yeah, no, I mean, it was unbelievably
literary.
Yeah.
I see. So I want to move away from Cato now, but still stay in this late Republican era, specifically right after the defeat of Pharsalus.
Yes.
So this is when Cato and his allies like Cicero, who were fighting with Pompey against Caesar, had lost. Right. So at this point, Pompey had died. Caesar was pursuing some of the remaining Pompeians. And there was an interesting increase in Stoic ideas in the time. And I'll quote to you your book. The only evil is vice. Since the conduct of Cicero and his friends during and after the Civil War has been blameless, it follows that no evil has befallen them. This is, of course, a classic Stoic argument, one that during this time becomes a central feature of Cicero, who's not a Stoic, Cicero's intellectual landscape. During this time, Cicero also elevated another Stoic tenet. Preferred indifferents are to be pursued, but an agent's virtue and hence happiness do not depend on the outcome of this pursuit. So tell us about how philosophy in general and Stoicism in particular acted as a way of consolation to the people who lost on the Pompeian side.
Right. So this was in the context of looking at a lot of letters that Cicero wrote and that other people wrote to him after the defeat at Pharsalus. So there are these former Pompeians, they're all sort of depressed, right, or traumatized. And so Cicero and also the other people doing a lot of work in the letters of consoling each other, which is something one did, right? But it's also a philosophical thing because philosophy is supposed to be a consolation when you were in trouble and when you were depressed. And it's right that there you see Cicero using many more of these Stoic arguments, which he can do, right? Because he's an academic skeptic and he can espouse these arguments, and that at this point seem apparently very convincing to him, which is that virtue is the only good and that the outcome doesn't matter. So if he can argue that my fellow Pompeians, we did the right thing, and now we were totally unsuccessful because we were beaten and our party was beaten, and now Caesar is dictator. But we don't have to be upset because we didn't do anything wrong. So we have this knowledge of having done the right thing, of having been virtuous. And this is a consolation in itself. So virtue is its own reward.
Right. I definitely find that philosophy has this consolatory function in my own life. In fact, so I grew up as a STEM major studying mathematics. And I got into philosophy because I wouldn't say depressed as a freshman at Columbia, but I was going through a lot of the usual teenage angst, growing pain stuff. And I got into philosophy and I got into mostly Buddhism initially because of that, because it acted as its consolation. In fact, when I look at my journal, the periods where I have the most journal entries are always when I'm feeling the worst.
Right.
And in the months where I have almost no journal entries, I'm living the best life.
Right.
Because there's nothing to figure out. Right.
Exactly.
And it wasn't until your book that I realized there's an entire genre of philosophy that is consolation.
Yeah.
So tell us about this genre that Cicero drew so heavily upon.
Right. So there is a genre, a philosophical genre of consolation, which is really about how to console people in distress. And I mean, we do that. Of course, we help out our friends, or when someone dies, we write a condolence letter. So typical situations are death, so loss of a family member, exile. And so there are certain tropes that you use. And since it's philosophical, right, one of the typical arguments that you make, again, is that something is not an evil.
Right. X is not an evil.
X is not an evil. So this happened, this person died, but that's actually not an evil because death is not an evil for the person who dies, or he died at the right time, or he was loved, or he was, you bring in all these reasons why it's not. So they don't really go in for this kind of thing like, oh, it is very bad and you have to work through your grief, which is a sort of much more modern, like confront this. It's more like you should not be upset or, to be too upset about this is the sign of an unmanly mind, or you're actually being selfish by being, mourning this person to whom nothing bad has actually happened and who is now. So there are all these sort of tropes, and they do get used here by Cicero and these other people, where they're indeed saying, no, we didn't do anything wrong. This was not an evil.
And of course, the specific Stoic argument that was drawn in this time also took that shape. X is not an evil. In this case, military defeat is not an evil, right? Anything but the loss of virtue itself is not an evil. And I want to get into the meat of our interview now, which is that I take this to be a damning critique of Stoicism in a very Nietzschean bent. And so let me explain what I mean through a quote of your book. Cicero sums up his argument. Even when everything else is lost, virtue nevertheless seems to be able to sustain itself. In other words, virtue is sufficient for happiness. Cicero and his defeated friends thus emerge not only as the moral victors of the Civil War, but as true philosophers who know how to effectively console themselves in one another. To me, that kind of sounds like Nietzsche's slave morality, right? Nietzsche famously says in the Genealogy of Morals that people who are weak or who are on the defeated side, they simply flip the hierarchy of values. Winning the battle of Pharsalus, that's not true victory. True victory is moral victory. And in this view, Stoicism is the philosophy of losers, right? It's for people who can't control the external world, and then they just cross their arms and they say, well, the internal virtue, that's where it matters. Do you think that this is a valid critique of Stoicism?
Well, there's another side of Stoicism, which is that everything is fated. So it's a deterministic philosophy, which is built on their cosmology. And so everything is A, fated to happen, and B, good, because this universe is good. This is the best of all possible worlds, sort of. So even if we're defeated here, ultimately in the sort of larger scheme of the universe, this is actually a good thing. And so by accepting this fate, you're actually you're being part of this whole. So there is a whole that is larger than you that we can't understand. But and Cicero doesn't so much make this argument there, but Marcus Aurelius does that a lot. So that, by doing what you're doing and by following fate, you're actually doing the work of this perfect universe. In the larger scheme of things, we are actually not sort of marginalized or defeated or whatever, but we're just as much as a sort of constructive element of that.
But isn't that just another version of coping? And shouldn't that make us suspicious of Stoicism? That it's a philosophy that consoles you, that everything is all well and good when you can't change the external world. Shouldn't that make us suspicious of Stoicism in some way?
Well, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, Stoicism, and this is true for Epicureanism too, and for a lot of these philosophies, they are largely, or at least maybe originally, for coping. So they are about, so you find yourself in this world where it seems like there are lots of things you can't control. And therefore you feel like bad things happening to you all the time, right? And they teach you that if you have the right mindset, if you understand the way things really are, I mean, allegedly, according to that philosophy, you know that you actually have the self-sufficiency because you are controlling the one thing that really counts. And so therefore you are in control. And these other things, you can't control them, but they don't count. So they're not actually valuable.
Maybe I should qualify my critique this way, which is whether we should be suspicious of Stoicism is whether its tenets are true, right? Or not. And that can only be discovered through a philosophical investigation. But I think you're agreeing that we should be suspicious of the spread of Stoicism, right? That people might have ulterior motives for adopting such a philosophy other than its truth, namely that it makes them feel better. And again, a great example here is the one you gave in your book about how Stoicism spread in the empire and not in the Republic, when people did have more control over their external world. So we should be, let me put it in even more qualified terms. It tells us something about society when philosophies like Stoicism spreads.
I think it's a reaction to a certain form of, in this case, like loss of political power or something like this. But as you were saying about your journaling, right? I mean, this could be true for philosophy or religion or other sort of systems in general. That, when is there a lot of use for them? Exactly, at those moments.
I find that Buddhism also has these sort of sociological roots of why it's spread, right? One of its core doctrines that everything is suffering. Mm-hmm. That seems quite hard to understand from the modern 21st century, at least Western perspective.
Yeah.
But in a time when, the infant mortality was so high, when so much more was out of your control, that was a much more natural doctrine to be able to see in the world. What do you make of Stoicism as well as Buddhism's rise in contemporary West today?
Yeah.
Does that mean we're also entering into an age where people feel less and less in control, as people did from the transition from republic to empire?
Yeah. No, I think it's an interesting question. I mean, I think partly it does replace other forms of coping mechanisms like organized religion, or works hand in hand with psychotherapy. It's an interesting phenomenon, and one that philosophers are often not very happy about, because they feel that the Stoicism that is very popular today is a kind of watered down Stoicism, which uses a lot of these coping strategies and which is very much stressing this kind of self-sufficiency.
Right.
Which is why
instead of political engagement or something.
Instead of political engagement, whereas, as we were saying earlier, Stoicism is very community oriented. Whereas this, which I understand is a sort of very popular sort of in the .com world in Silicon Valley, that it's all about
Stoicism,
pop Stoicism, that it's all about like the kind of lone wolf.
Right.
So that's not what ancient Stoicism is about. At the same time, there are a lot of basic ideas, and also there are sort of techniques of the self that the Stoics use that are also used in, say, cognitive behavioral therapy that can be very useful.
I want to conclude this interview on an observation that you made about philosophy as a coping mechanism in some way. On one hand, I think it makes me very suspicious of philosophy.
Right.
That philosophy is being promulgated as well as created, not because it's true, but because it satisfies some kind of psychological need, right?
Yeah.
And the example here would be the commonsensical objection I made about the preferred indifference.
Right.
Like, clearly, it seems to me you're building a metaphysical theory such that you can be an optimist and have full control over your life. On the other hand, philosophy portrays itself as an art of living. And there's a part of me that says, well, who cares if it's not true? If it's an effective coping mechanism, then maybe it is actually fulfilling what it's supposed to do. What are your thoughts on this?
Right. I mean, from a philosophical perspective, of course, the second one is not satisfying. But from a personal perspective, I mean, why not? As for the first, I mean, the interesting thing is that at least in ancient philosophy, that it's true and that it works as a coping mechanism goes hand in hand.
I see.
Right? Because it's this very intellectual view of philosophy, but also of the human mind, which really goes back to Socrates, which is like, once you understand it intellectually, it's gonna help you psychologically.
Right.
So all the problem is really ignorance.
Right.
So you have to have the knowledge, and then, for example, the knowledge of what is truly a good, right? And then once you have the knowledge, your psychological state will fall into place.
Right.
So at least ideally, these two are like totally connected.
Right. In other words, there was a hidden premise behind my first point, which is that I took the fact that it's practically helpful as a reason to be suspicious of the idea. But you're saying there's another way to read that, which is to say, to read that as a validation that the idea is actually true.
That's right. That's right.
I see. Well, thank you, Professor, for rescuing me from a potential error.
Well, thank you very much.
Thanks for watching my interview. If you want to go even deeper into these ideas, then join my email list at greatbooks.io. You'll not only get lectures and interviews, but also transcripts, book summaries, and essays, all to help you explore the most important books in history. If you like this interview, there's 2 more that I filmed with Professor Volk on the ideas and people that shaped the late Roman Republic. One of them is on the rise of Epicureanism, and the other one is on the intellectual life of Cicero and Caesar. Another direction you could take this is to dive into a dramatization of this time period. Shakespeare's Julius Caesar covers the exact events we discussed in this interview. It's one of my favorite plays by the Bard and has shocking relevance to our current political situation. If that interests you, then check out my lecture on Shakespeare's Caesar. You can find links to everything we discussed today in the description, as well as on my website, greatbooks.io. Thank you.